We're going to take a closer look at the discourse device of backgrounding. For those of you who have had Greek, and maybe we're looking at the Logos academic blog, we've been talking about the use of circumstantial participles, but this is really focused for people who haven't studied Greek, and especially those who are using the high definition New Testament. So I've got the high definition New Testament open up on the left-hand side, the Lexham Discourse Greek New Testament over on the right-hand side. And if you look at Matthew 28:18, you'll see that some of the text is in grayscale. And the HDNT and LDGNT both come with a glossary, so you can just get a pop-up description of whatever the device is. And what the grayscale stands for is the device of backgrounding. It's the use of a non-finite or a secondary verb form to background the action and help prioritize the action, especially when there's in cases where there's more than one action or one verb in a clause or in a sentence. So for instance, in verse 18, you've got two different actions, Jesus coming and Jesus saying to them. And based on the ESV translation, both of these are main verbs. He came and he said to them. But in Greek, came is a participle. It's not a main verb. And what that says is that the writer has made the choice to use a participle for some reason, and in this case, it's to background the action, to prioritize it with respect to the main action of speaking. And what that does is it keeps the spotlight on what Jesus said to them rather than the action. It makes the action of him coming to them secondary. And what that does is it casts the spotlight on his speech, which makes really good sense. Now let's take a look at the speech itself. In verse 19, we have go in the grayscale, which is marked as backgrounding. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And again, in English, both of these are main verbs. This doesn't reflect poorly on the ESV as being a bad translation. The use of the main verb has to do with Greek not being English. Greek uses participles far more than is desirable or acceptable in English. And so they're doing an English translation. That's why they've used main verbs. But if I highlight in the Lexham Discourse Greek New Testament, you'll see that both of these words, the go and, are derived from parepthentes in the Greek, the one participle. And so the benefit of using the HDNT, one of the benefits, is being able to find use of grammatical devices like this to background the action. And so if one of the foundational principles is that choice implies meaning. And so if Matthew has chosen to use a participle, then there's some meaning associated with it. And so the HDNT marking up these things helps me slow down and think more about them. But probably the best way to learn more about backgrounding is not to read more definitions, but to look at more data, look at more examples. So if I just right click on some of the grayscale text and come on down and click on background here in the right click menu, then I can come over and do an inline search. And what that does is it's going to find all of the examples in the high definition New Testament and just give them to me. Notice how the verse ranges just jump down. What it does is it gives me each of the verses where one of these is found. We've already looked at Matthew 28:18 and 19. Let's scroll on down to Mark 1:7. So in this subpoint here, notice that there's two different actions, stooping down and untying. This is John the Baptist speaking about Jesus and his preeminent role over him. And John's speech uses a participle for stooping down. And what this does is it prioritizes the action and makes the stooping down secondary to the action of untying. Same thing in Mark 1:10. As Jesus is coming up from the water after being baptized, we've got two different actions here, coming up from the water and him seeing something. And by using the participle for coming up out of the water, it keeps the spotlight on what he saw because you only have one main action instead of two. And what he sees then is what's in the spotlight, the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending like a dove. Same thing, we go down to Mark 1:16, passing along the sea. This is actually translated in English as a participle. It's backgrounded, just like what we have in Greek. And what that does is it keeps the main spotlight on what he saw, which is Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net in the sea. So the great thing about participles, whether you've studied Greek or not, is when they're used as substitutes for main verbs, they have this effect of backgrounding the main action and keeping the spotlight on that one, on the one main action that's left. And so if you've got the high definition New Testament, or if you purchase the Lexham Discourse Greek New Testament, it actually comes bundled with the HDNT. You can use that for learning more about these devices. The other way to do a search is to right click on one of these and then do a search this resource. And what that's going to do is pull up every instance of them and let you look through them in more detail. And if you're preaching through, say Romans or something like that, you can click on passages and narrow it down to just a shorter range of books. These are ranges that I've added to my collection, but what that does then is it just lets me see all of them in Romans. So that's a brief overview of what backgrounding is, or for those of you who are working in the Lexham Discourse Greek New Testament, those would be circumstantial frames of reference. They're a great tool to be able to help you understand how the writers prioritize the action, and they occur really frequently, so that this is a device that's worth getting to know because it's got a lot of practical payoff in your Bible study.